Whenever.
Set?
Yep.
All right. It's my pleasure today to introduce Debi Craig, who's going to talk. Her program is on Through Susan's Eyes. Susan B. Anthony, who lived in Washington County, lived in Battenville, grew up there, taught there until she moved on to other areas and other things. I also want to introduce Sandy McReynolds, who's worked with Debi on this project as well. Debi is a long-time history person in Washington County. She's past president of the Washington County Historical Society. I can't go through everything that she does because we don't have enough time on the battery to do that. But she has done history, and one of her interests is the North Star Project and the redevelopment of Susan B. Anthony's home over in Battenville. And so this is an outstanding talk. I listened to it for the second time, learned more the second time than I did the first time, and so it's my pleasure to introduce Debi Craig.
Thanks. First of all, do you guys know where Battenville is?
No idea.
Okay, that's why. Because I thought this isn't going to mean anything unless when I get done talking to you at some point, you can drive over there and see everything. Because we're lucky that this is one of the places, in fact, I've been talking to a number of people recently about like Albany County and their historic sites and other counties around us and their historic sites. They have maybe 10 parking lots and 2 of the original historic sites left. We have 10 historic sites left and 2 parking lots, so it's kind of the opposite. But if you go to Schuylerville and then cross the river, turn left on Route 29 right downtown, like you're going south, that's Route 29. You want to just get on 29, stay on 29. You're going to go right through Greenwich, and then Battenville is about 4 miles past Greenwich, still on 29. It's like you're going to follow the signs like you're going to Salem. And when you come, there'll be a sign that says Battenville, and you almost are through it before you realize because it's so small. And the Anthony House is actually on the left, and there is now a historic marker finally in front of it. For years there was a sign that somebody had bought that just lived in the neighborhood and said she needs to be recognized. And so I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I applied with Washington County Historical Society to get a real historic marker. And so we have, it's not one of the blue and gold ones, it's actually, there's a foundation called the Pomeroy Foundation, and they do like different colors of historic markers, like historic schoolhouses are brown and ivory. Susan B. Anthony's house has a white and purple and gold. If you do any kind of handcrafts, it's red and gold. So if you drive around, you start seeing different colors, that's why. But at any rate, so you go 4 miles out of Greenwich, the actual house is going to be on your left, and there's a road to the right where you can go and visit the cemetery where her sister and her grandparents are buried, and directly across the road from that is the one-room schoolhouse where they told her girls don't need to know how to do long division, and her father pulled all the kids out of school and started his own school. So, and it's all right there, and none of it has a historic marker on it. So at any rate, if you're interested, I'll give you my contact information, and I could even meet you somewhere and show you around. It's I love it that much. So from the time I was old enough to understand who she was, our dad, and I grew up in Hebron, so whenever we went to Greenwich, we had to go through Battenville. It was really the only way to get there. And he'd say to me, don't you ever forget, she's the reason you can vote. You need to remember who she is. I was like 8. I'm going, yeah, Dad, whatever. And then as I got older, he didn't stop. He just kept it up. Every time I was in the car with him, don't forget that's Susan B. Anthony's home. And right up until he passed away in 2008, he said to me, it's the reason you're so interested in saving that house because of all those years that I bugged you about it. And I said, well, what do you think? You know, but at any rate, it is really interesting that she was right here, and most people don't know it. In fact, we were just talking about the fact that Rochester would kind of like for us to go away because that's where she moved from here. They claim her. It's like there's other historic figures. If a town or a county gets a hold of them, they don't want anybody else to acknowledge that they lived there first. And she actually lived in, she was born in Adams, Massachusetts. We're in the process of working on like a driving tour that will start in Adams and go all the way to Rochester and stop at all the different places that she was involved with. So this is one of her quotes, and I'll let you guys read that on your own. This was near the end of her life, and she lived until 1906. But I'll tell you a little bit more about her life in Adams. She was born there on February 15th, 1820, in an area called West Grove, which is out in the country. And that house has actually been made into a museum now. At about the same time the Anthony house that I'm talking about was acquired, this one was for sale. And a group from the Rochester area called Feminists for Life. And they don't mean feminists forever, they mean feminists pro-life. So that was the only marker on the house at the time. It was vacant, and that would have been in around 2006. And since then, they have actually made it into a museum that's operational. So when she was 6, her family moved across state lines to upstate New York because her father accepted a job running a new mill. And today we're about roughly a half an hour from where she lived in Battenville. They remembered the children that hadn't been born yet when they moved to Battenville, but Susan and her older sister, and I think one of the brothers, was born. The community was named for the Batten Kill, which sits right on, the house practically sits right across the road from the river. And you can see this is an old map. And I don't think it shows the house. Do you remember seeing it? Oh, there's the tavern.
Well, there is.
The tavern there is right next door to the house, so the house is where that dot is. And the tavern was built right around 1800, so it was built approximately, I'm trying to think of the actual year that they built the house. It was late 1829, 1830, I can't remember the exact date. I think I've got it in here later on. Oh yeah, there you go. They built the house in around, they started it in around 1830, they actually moved in 1832. So it was here that she spent much of her childhood and her young adult life, and it was here on the Battenkill where the seeds began to be planted in her mind about how unfair the treatment of women was. And she was only a kid. She only lived here until she was 24. She was about 6 years old when they moved to Washinton County, and then she lived here for approximately 19 years after that. One of the former owners of the house identified it by putting that sign that you just saw in front of it, and then they replaced it with another sign that looked just like it, and this is the sign I was talking about, that is the white and purple with the gold up at the top. The DAR set a plaque into the marble retaining wall in front of the house, but because the fast-moving traffic, and it is literally maybe 2 feet between you and the road and this plaque, you're taking your life in your own hands if you try to stand there and read it. But that's the one on the left, and that's set right into the marble wall. The marble wall wouldn't have been there when the Anthonys lived there. It's interesting, they've dug down to make the road so the actual house is like up here now, when in reality it was down right next to the road, which is kind of weird. So, what most people don't know is that the little community there, as well as the towns of Easton and Greenwich, were a virtual history book to that family and how they happened to come there and what a profound effect their presence had. And as I said before, that first marker was placed in 2022. This is a picture of the old mill. It originally was a cotton mill, and there was a judge named McLean who started up the mill, and then he heard about how well Daniel Anthony was doing in Adams, Massachusetts. So he hired him to come to Battenville to run his mill. And it's fallen down a lot more than that. They've kind of been pushing it down. The original mill that Susan's father worked at had burned in 1870. Then they rebuilt it. And if you look up at the top, you can see how black those bricks are. They'd gone through the fire of the first one. So now that whole section that you can see there is caved in, and you can actually look into the mill from the road. Not this time of the year though, because there's leaves on the trees. So then that was what it looked like before it started caving in. It was used as a paper mill, and they put there was a whole big issue because they put a lot of chemicals into the water. If you stood on the bridge across the Battengill and looked toward the factory, you could see the stuff coming out in the water underneath. It was pretty awful. And for years, they wouldn't allow kids to swim at the public beach. That's what, a couple of miles from there, Sandy, toward the village?
I would say it's at least 2 miles.
2 miles,
Maybe
that's
3
what I was
miles.
guessing. But it was close enough so that they would be getting all those chemicals in their bodies if they swam there. And for a long time, they wouldn't let you eat anything that you caught out of the river there either. So they left Adams for Battenville in 1826. As I told you, the original mill burned in 1870. And I have to ask your forgiveness because I lost my reading glasses after I got here this morning. So I'm getting further and further away in hopes that I can keep reading.
Do you want to use these again?
It's really, pardon?
Do you want to borrow these again?
You know what, they're just enough too strong that I think
Okay.
it would not help, but
Okay.
thank you. So they think that for a while they lived with the judge in his 22-room house, and Susan got to be good friends with the judge's grandson. This house is actually John McClane's brother's house. If you've ever seen the movie The Horse Whisperer, or if you've ever heard of it, the far end of the house is featured in that movie pretty prominently. And they don't make a big deal about it, but if you're from this area and you've ever seen the house, you'll be watching the movie and you'll go, wait a minute, I know where that is. But it looked like this about 2 years ago with all the great big trees. It was just recently sold because the two gentlemen who lived there, one died and the other one is in a nursing home. And the new people cut down all those big beautiful trees because the front of the house was so damp it was beginning to rot, so they had to get rid of those. Let's see. So she got to be friends with the grandson, Aaron. They had a lot of discussions on politics and human rights. In the back room of the house, the walls are lined with boxboard. Yep, there it is on the right. They had been stenciled for delivery at the McLean Mill. There was an additional wing on the house that was removed after 1861 and moved across the road to serve as a tenant house, and that actually burned down. The slave quarters, which is interesting too that they were slave owners, the McLeans still had slaves when the Anthonys arrived from New York, and it said that Susan and her siblings were afraid because they'd never seen anyone with dark skin before. And as I told you, it was in the Horse Whisperer. There are a number of houses that are in the area still that were built for the mill workers. Several are still there, and the Anthonys lived in one such house while their new house was being built across the road. This is the home that they lived in, and it's been torn down now. It's not there anymore. Daniel hired workers to come and make the bricks right on the premises. Susan wrote that she helped her mother prepare more than 40 meals for the workers. This is actually a work order for the mill, and the handwriting that you see on there is Susan's father's own handwriting. And that, I'm trying to think who loaned me that. It was from a local historical society. I was able to get a copy of that. So the Anthony house itself is very interesting. It's brick on this side, and the other side is now a mother-in-law apartment. Originally, that was where the schoolhouse was, and you'll see a picture of that later on. It has many interesting features inside. One of the things that is there is what's called a coffin niche, and that's where you often see pictures of elaborate vases and so forth. But what they really used it for is if somebody died in the house, they didn't take them to a funeral parlor. They took them downstairs, they would put them in the coffin, carry it down the stairs, and the purpose of that niche was the corner of the coffin would go into that, and then they could swing it so that they could keep it level going down the stairs. Then at the very bottom of the stairs is what's called a coffin door, and it's about so high. And the purpose of that was so that if it was hot in the house at nighttime, they would slide the coffin out onto the porch, and then the next day when they had calling hours, and again, because there were no funeral parlors, the family would lay the person out, that's what they called it, in the hallway, and people would come and pay their respects right in their own home that they lived in. And the one that was buried there from there first was Lucy Anthony's mother, who had moved here also from Massachusetts with her husband to live with her daughter's family. It's believed that the elegant staircase and the decorative wood trim that you're gonna see in some more of these pictures wasn't there when the Anthonys moved there. That was more modern. They think that was put in the 1870s when a different family who ran the mill lived in the house. There was another staircase that has been removed now, but when they started ripping stuff out of the house, they found the footprint in the floor. They could tell where the staircase had been. So the Haskins family were the ones that owned the mill after the McLeans. They changed a lot of the walls, the staircases I mentioned, and this was about maybe 4 or 5 years. The house was lived in until 2006. The people who were living there lost it to taxes, and what ended up happening was it was taken over by a mortgage corporation. New York State bought it for $1 in 2006 because of the work of 2 different assemblymen, one from Saratoga County, who also represented Washinton County, and one from Long Island, who was a big fan of Susan B. Anthony. Anyway, the 2 of them got the house donated for $1, and then the state took it over and they left it. They didn't turn the heat on, they didn't have any electricity on in the house, and the house filled up with black mold, which was a big problem. And that's why there had been no temperature control in the house when these pictures were taken. So this is before they gutted the inside, but as you can see, it's starting to deteriorate. This is probably 2 to 3 years after the state took the house over. And now it looks nothing like that. I don't even think we have any of the pictures the way it really looks. Just
I
realized
don't
that.
think we have any of the
Yeah, we
gutted.
need to insert some of those.
Somebody needs to just take me up there. and I
So
can do it.
this part that you can see is the actual old part of the house where the bricks are. And then the mother-in-law apartment, which is kind of to the left of this section, has been, it's been restored more because it wasn't as old in the first place, and they just replaced the wallboard inside with the idea that maybe eventually somebody would live in the house and work on it and try to keep working on it to make it so that it can eventually be open to the public. Let's see, I talked about Mother Reed being laid out. So both of the Reeds, who would be Lucy Anthony's parents, moved from Massachusetts, as I mentioned before. And Susan's little sister, Eliza Taft, as well, is also buried in the Battenville Cemetery that I mentioned that's across the river from the house. The sister died of scarlet fever at the age of 2.5 on May 18th. That's interesting, that's tomorrow's anniversary. In 1834, so wow, almost 200 years ago, 190 years ago this year. And she is buried there. And if you go to the cemetery in Rochester where the rest of the family is buried, if you look on the back of the gravestones, it actually says this one is buried in Battenville. It's pretty interesting how they did it. It's said that many years later when Susan's mother Lucy passed away, that a tear-stained baby dress was found amongst her belongings from the loss of the little girl Eliza, who died in Battenville, and then they had to leave her behind when they moved. And these are the graves of Susan's grandparents, who would be her mom's parents. Her grandfather, Daniel, who's on the right, fought in the Revolutionary War, and both of them were Baptists. Most of the family on Daniel's side were Quakers, but the Reeds were Baptists. So Eliza, the younger sister, as I mentioned, died in 1834. Her gravestone kind of disappeared, and we were looking for it, and the 2 guys who lived in that big white house that I mentioned before said, oh, we have a gravestone in the backyard with plants on it. We don't know whose it is. So he took us out, and we started flipping over the top piece, and it said, Eliza D.A.U. of, and I said, I think this is it. And then they flipped it over, and the bottom part said, Lucy and Daniel Anthony, and I said, this is the gravestone. So that was really, really a cool find. It was broken in 2 places. There's a fellow from Hoosick Falls named Joe Farinini, great guy, and he repaired the stone for us, put it back together. And that's him the day we rededicated the stone. But the funny thing with this stone is whoever had removed it from the cemetery threw it over the bank, of the White House where they cut down all the trees in the yard, on the other side of the river. So why they threw it away there, I have absolutely no idea. I'm just glad that the people who lived in the house saved it. There was a fellow too who was an Eagle Scout project, working on an Eagle Scout project. He was from Saratoga County, and he and his buddies did a grid of the whole cemetery. And they noticed as they were walking around that there were these divots in the ground where it kind of dipped down. They started digging with their hands. They were pulling up big pieces of sod. And as they would dig up the sod, it would bring up a bunch of earth underneath. And they found that a gravestone had fallen where that divot was. There's probably a lot more of them there that have fallen that we don't even know about. But this stone was broken in 3 places. This is Anthony McLean, who is Susan's sister's son. He passed away at 18 months. I don't know from what, but it was an early childhood disease that they didn't have a vaccine for at that point. The other thing that the boys found was the footstone, which is kind of unusual. They don't usually use those anymore. That was in 3 pieces, and Joe Ferranini also repaired that. So this would be the house where Susan's sister Guelma and Aaron lived, and they would be the parents of the little boy who died. This house is still there. It doesn't look quite as bad as it does here now because they've cut down all the trees are around it, but there are so many trees and bushes and stuff close by that a lot of it is rotted out, and one doorway is caved in, a window is caved in, and in the higher part, all the floors have also caved in from the edge of the house. In fact, it's probably worse now because I haven't been in there for probably 10 or 15 years. The floors were still attached to the edge of the room, but in the middle they'd caved in. And we actually dared to go in and go around the edge. And the upstairs in the high part is completely sound because they had put a new slate roof on it in the 1960s, and you could walk anywhere you wanted to upstairs. The really weird thing was, though, with the upstairs, while we were up there, one of my friends was taking some pictures, and she caught some pictures of orbs, which, I don't know, I had never believed in that sort of thing, but you could see them. There was no question that there were things floating around in the air. So I think some of the Anthony family is still visiting in Pattonville. So there's Joe with the restored nephew's gravestone, and there's the footstone in the back by him. And that gives you an idea the grave was only about this long, very small because he was a child. This would be the schoolhouse that I mentioned before. It's a private home, and they have a business called Schoolhouse Maple. They tap their maple trees and make it into maple syrup, and the blackboards are still on the wall. It's really cool, as you can see. So, and the really cool thing for me is that one of my former students' parents lived in the schoolhouse first, and then they wanted to retire and move to a different place, and now their daughter, who was my student, lives there. So I have access to the house whenever I want to. Mm-hmm. Now this is what I was telling you about before. The schoolhouse is to the left on the upstairs. These were carriage sheds downstairs. In the 1960s, that part was totally torn off the house. It because of the trees that were close by, and because it's hard to see, but there's a hill that's directly behind the house. If you drive by it now, that same hill is completely covered with trees. They're very close to the house. And what happened was there was a lot of rotting in the wood on the back because it could never get dried out because the sunlight never got in there. And so consequently, they just said it's not safe for tearing it down, and the owners at the time ripped that part right off. But it's too bad because they lost the schoolhouse that was upstairs. And that's where Daniel Anthony moved his children and the girls from the mill after they stopped attending the schoolhouse across the river. Okay, Sandy, that's what the schoolhouse looked like right before they tore it down. And this is the mother-in-law apartment that I talked about. This part was all new in the 1990s. This gentleman is Hiram Corliss. He was a founder of the American Medical Association, lived and grew up in Greenwich, and he's buried there with a newer gravestone. Somebody, we don't know what year, did a whole series of gravestones to his family, and they all look just like that one. but they're all from many years after he passed away. But he was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad, which was something that was very prevalent in the Greenwich area and other parts of Washington County.
Was he a Quaker?
He was not. He was not. In fact, he and 12 other families founded what they called the Free Congregational Church in Greenwich. If you know Greenwich at all, if you come into Greenwich from Salem, you come to a stoplight where it hits Route 372. And you make a left like you're going toward Cambridge. On the right, there used to be a real estate office for a fellow named Alan Brown. And just past that, there's a vacant lot. That's where the church sat. And then the road takes a hard left to go toward Cambridge. His mansion was there. And in the 1960s, that mansion was torn down, and they built a new ranch house there. So I think there might be one of the outbuildings that was original to when he lived there, but that's what the house looked like. Yeah, it was really something. And there were people living in that house until the 1960s, because I located a fellow online from Virginia who lived in that house with his grandparents when he was growing up. And he could tell me all kinds of cool stuff. Like, the legend was from the basement, there was a tunnel out to the river, and they used to take runaways, and he would hide runaways in his basement in a room that didn't have any windows in it. The legend was that they'd go in this underground tunnel down to the river and then go by rowboat across the river, up the bank on the other side to somebody else's house that would keep them safe until the slave catchers had gone away. And there hadn't been a problem with that until the Fugitive Slave Law passed in, I think it was 1850. What happened was, all of a sudden there was a bounty, and anybody who was a runaway, you could get paid if you turned them in. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, they did get turned in. The interesting thing about Greenwich, though, is nobody ever got turned in. The people who were active in the Underground Railroad were mostly lawyers, physicians, people with money, and they didn't buck them. It's interesting because and also like the trying to think of the name of the family, William Maury, businessman. He and his wife had a room in the basement that would accommodate up to 30 people. And again, nobody ever got caught and turned in from that
You
place.
know why? Because people back then knew snitches got stitches.
Right.
Just saying.
Although I think that Corliss is the one. Susan had a surgery done to correct her crossed eyes, and they've never said exactly who it was that did the surgery, but it failed. And in any of the books you read about Hiram Corliss, it never says he's the one that did the surgery on her eyes. Maybe he is, and maybe he isn't. I don't know for a fact.
You know, nobody wants to be associated with the one that did that.
Right. So this is a house on the road to Easton. Susan's parents were friends with the folks who lived here who were Quakers. And their names were Job and Esther Wilbur, and this house still is there. It has a very long driveway, as you can see in the picture on the right. One evening, the Wilburs were having dinner, and their grandson was out playing with a hoop and a stick in the yard, and he came running into the house and told his grandparents that someone was coming bringing a package, which meant there was a runaway that was being brought to them to hide. And so they quickly spirited the man into their house, got him up to the attic, and no sooner did they get him up there than somebody knocked on the door, and it was slave catchers that were trying to find him. And what ended up happening was they went through the whole house, they didn't see anything, until all of a sudden one of them looked up at the ceiling and said, "What's that hole?" And they had taken him up. That was interesting, I'm sorry. They had taken him up into the attic, and he had grabbed a knife off the table. We don't need that for now. It'd take longer to put it back together than it will to finish the talk. So at any rate, they decided that they didn't want to go after him because he had a knife. So what they did was they left to find some people to help them. While they were gone, Mrs. Wilbur dressed him up in her clothes. They took him in another wagon, covered him all up with straw, and took him into Greenwich to Dr. Corliss's house, where they hid him for 3 or 4 days, and then off he went to Canada. And he eventually ended up coming back, and there is still a cane that was made from a combination of a piece of tree branch and a deer antler that he used to fend off the dogs when he was running away. And it's still owned by the Wilbur family in Greenwich to this day. All right, so let me see if I can get my pages back in order here. This is a meeting house where Susan's father started to take his family when they first moved here. It is down Route 40 from Greenwich toward Troy, and it's kind of up in the hills. It's a really pretty location. There's a huge cemetery all around it, which is where we looked for Susan's sister in the first place and didn't find her. This, I can't read the exact date. Sandy, can you see it? Is it 1845?
1880 established.
Okay. There was like a log cabin there before this. And so there was going to be a Quaker meeting. Susan's father brought her with him. She had begged and begged, even though it was January, she wanted to come. What ended up happening is she had a brand new coat. It was plaid, very colorful, which you didn't expect. When you think about Susan B. Anthony, you think mostly about her wearing black. But he brought her, and when she got there, she sat over by the stove and just was very polite and quiet. But one of the eldresses of the church realized she was there, and she said to her, "You cannot stay here, you are a member." And so in January, they made this child go outside in the cold with her. They didn't let her wear a coat until the meeting was over, and her father didn't leave. He stayed in the meeting. So she's outside. She was so cold, she went to the neighbor's house. They finally let her in, but the problem was they had a great big dog. The great big dog jumped on her and tore her new coat, and of course she was just devastated by that. And her father said to the Quakers, "You'll immediately take my children into the membership so that my children never have to go through anything like that again." And it said Susan always remembered that event right up until the end of her life. But that meeting house is still there. There's another meeting house closer to Greenwich that's made out of brick. This is where they meet in the summertime, because there's no central heating, and the other one they meet in the wintertime. The foundation for Daniel Anthony's store is almost directly across from the tavern that I mentioned, which you're going to see in just a minute. This is a cool story. This foundation, and I'll be telling you more about it later, I had no idea how long the building had been gone. I thought it was maybe 25 or 30 years. But in the 1930s, somebody bought the building, numbered the pieces, and they took it to Falmouth, Massachusetts, rebuilt it, and made it into an antique store, and it's still there. So that's kind of cool. But he built a store there because there was no place for his workers to go to get provisions. There was no place for them to be able to go to buy food or clothes or whatever. And interestingly, he would not sell any kind of alcohol in his store. The other thing that he started when he moved there was a post office, because they'd never had one. This is the tavern that I mentioned in the earlier picture. This was built right around 1800. As you can see, there's 3 doors on the front. The door to the left is the tavern. The middle door goes up the stairs to where the lodgings were, and the door on the right is like a sitting room area. The people who owned it previously had it furnished in period furniture, but not furniture that would have been from there originally. When I was a kid, this was an old antique shop, and that whole front area was just full of stuff. They had every kind of imaginable piece of junk you could possibly want to collect. So, but that was called the Stoops Hotel because it was owned by someone whose last name was Stoops. This is a copy of Susan's teacher's license from when she first became a teacher. She had to pass a test, and the first time she taught, I think she was 15 years old. But that's her New York State teacher's license. She taught in a number of schools around the Greenwich area. This one's in the Village, and connected to it, we're looking at the schoolhouse part, but connected to it is a house, and they just built the two together. The folks who lived there verified for me that this was a schoolhouse. But what they told me is this home was owned also by a fellow whose name was Kim Gannon, who you probably won't recognize that name, but he was pretty famous back in the 1940s because he penned the lyrics to a little Christmas song called "I'll Be Home for Christmas." And he is buried in Greenwich. He and his wife, when they passed away, She passed away a number of years after he did. Left $1 million to the village of Greenwich to provide special services and things for the children. And so they have a splash pad and a bunch of other stuff that they have done. There's a youth center that's partially funded by the Gannon Fund. But Susan never lived here, she just taught in this place, but the Gannons lived in a number of different places in Greenwich. This is another school that she taught in. It's outside of Greenwich, it's now a private home. In a section of the town called Reed's Corners, which you just have to keep going until you get there. I couldn't tell you how to get there.
Go through this Greenwich Cemetery, keep going straight.
Okay, that's
On
what I thought
52.
you go, yeah. Go out, is it
Cutting 52.
Prospect or Cottage?
Cottage.
Prospect. Okay, Cottage Street.
Is that off of where Riding Road is?
No,
No.
it's the other way.
Oh,
Ryan Road would be out 29 towards Salem.
okay.
You're thinking of the school there was the Hardscrabble School, which was Center Falls. That one has been made into a B&B now on 29.
Right.
That one, yeah, that would be the one. Up until a few years ago, it looked like the top pictures, and a young woman from Greenwich and her dad bought it, and this is what it looks like now. You can actually stay in the old school. It's absolutely lovely inside. They did a lot of work on it, and it too has all the blackboards that's still on the walls. They also were able to repurpose some of the ceiling lights. This building had been electrified in the 1940s, and they still have what was the sink in the restroom. One of those tiny, it's so little. But that's about halfway between Greenwich and Battenville on Route 29, just to give you a frame of reference. This is the way the Anthony House looked in 2006 when it went up for auction. That is the original sign that was in front of the house. That sign, the metal pieces on the top rusted out. It fell down and it was rotted, so they threw it away, replaced it with a new one. Now you can see her sister Guelma's house to the left, that gold wall that you can see, and the mother-in-law apartment is between the two, but it's back so you can't see it here. This is the east end of the house toward Salem. This is the south end looking toward where the mill sits, what's left of the mill. In 1839, there was a big depression. The mill closed. The Anthonys lost everything, including their house. They even had to sell sugar, underwear, everything, wedding gifts that Mrs. Anthony had received, to pay their bills so that they didn't lose more. They had a brother of Lucy Reed, Anthony, come and bid on certain ones of their belongings to try to keep them in the family. And from what I understand, he did get some of them. This building was closer to Greenwich. It was a 3-story, and you can see that there's a window on the end, that there's no windows on this side. The very top floor was a dance hall.